Have you ever done something really stupid that you regret in hindsight? Of course you have. That's the human condition. After fracturing my ulna, after trying to drift my bicycle as a high school student, I knew something had to change. What's going on, guys? For those who are new here, my name is Kevin Jabal, physician entrepreneur based in Las Vegas, formerly training in plastic surgery. Here's what personal rules are, why I think they're important, how they've saved me from making many terrible decisions, and how to implement them best in your own life. I've been setting my own personal rules for essentially all of my adult life, and I do think it's something that many people could really benefit from. I actually started taking it much more seriously after my first needle stick as a medical student in the operating room, and we'll talk more about that later. So why do we even need personal rules? As humans, we can be insanely impulsive, and our decision-making abilities are sometimes really compromised based on the situation we're in, based on substances, based on peers, based on a lot of factors. We don't always think that clearly. So if you've ever had road rage or gotten blackout drunk or seen Middle Eastern bicycle drifting videos on YouTube and thought it was a great idea yourself, then this shouldn't be news to you. So there's these things in day-to-day life that we know we shouldn't do. We shouldn't steal, we shouldn't hurt people, we shouldn't drive so recklessly as to endanger ourselves and those around us, things like that. But you would still be surprised what nonsense we're able to convince ourselves of if we don't have these personal rules. Now, I'm not saying you need to live like a robot. That's definitely not the case. I have personal rules, but I still live quite a spontaneous, adventurous, fun-filled life. It's just that I set some of these parameters for myself because I know I have the capacity to do some really stupid and I have a long backlog of events to prove that point, and I'm sure you do as well. So where did this all start? Around 6 years ago, I was on a rotation at the Navy Balboa base in San Diego as a medical student. I bonded with this really cool resident. We were essentially bonding over our shared bad memory, if you will. I don't think that we really have bad memory, but it's more that if I don't try to memorize or remember something, then it's just very probable that I will forget it. But if I try to memorize something, then I'm usually okay. So of course, I shared Anki, flashcard spaced repetition, Lord and Savior at the time for me. He shared with me this document called Professional Lessons Learned. And essentially, he tracked everything that was important in a professional setting that he wasn't studying and writing down, right? So one thing he shared with me was how he approached research. And it was pretty basic, but it was like a nice structured way to make research less painful. I thought that was great. In fact, this actually sparked my whole obsession with optimizing my own research. That took me like a year or two after that of experimenting and tweaking so that I could publish as many papers and abstracts as possible in the shortest amount of time. That was the day I created my own lessons learned document, with the first entry being to keep and maintain this document. The main difference was that his was professional lessons learned, and mine was both professional and personal lessons and rules. Now, the third entry, just a few months later, after creating the document, recounts my first ever needle stick. The patient was negative for any bloodborne transmissible diseases. I was wearing 2 gloves. It was a solid needle, not a hollow needle, etc., etc. So the risk was pretty low, but still, not something you want to repeat, something that you want to minimize the risk of ever happening again. So I have this paragraph recounting the series of events and the case, and for obvious reasons, I'm not gonna go into those details here, but I do have 5 take-home points that I wrote underneath that. So first, always be patient and never rush when you're in the operating room. Second, avoid touching the needle as much as possible, including repositioning it on the needle driver. Instead, use pickups. Third, never have your hand near the needle, even if not directly in its path, as the needle can slip in different directions. Always use a tool instead of your hand. Number 4, this was the mistake I made. I could have used a tool like pickups or asked for assistance to help keep the panis out of my working area versus using my hand. And number 5, if I feel the situation is unsafe, it's best to raise the concern in a tactful way, even if that comes with the risk of being judged, written off, or having a momentary negative impression on that attending. So when I go through any of these events and I do this post-mortem analysis, the focus is always on taking responsibility. What could I have done differently so that a similar situation in the future doesn't repeat itself? And sure, you can always point the blame at someone else, right? So on that day, for example, the attending was rushing all of us. There were multiple people crammed together, closing single small incisions from one end and the other end. And spacing was an issue, maintaining proper technique and posture was an issue. All those things were not optimal. And that actually is what point number 5 kind of talks about. But still, if I'm pointing the blame at other people, it's much more likely to happen again. So there's several other entries on the list, including one relating to cooking and fire safety, to having close calls on a bicycle and just safety with cars in general, best practices with finances and letting people borrow money. The reason I write these down is because a lot of these lessons I would totally forget if I didn't write them down. By having them all in this single, centralized, simple, and pretty brief document, it's a lot easier to actually remember them. Now, I don't think that every single personal rule needs to be written down in a document, right? There are certain rules that are just really deeply ingrained in who I am that I know I'm never gonna cross and I don't even need to write them down. But the key here is that you trust your past self and know that your future self will be more impulsive, be kind of monkey-minded, and do things that are illogical and just not good decisions. And this is obviously particularly helpful when it comes to situations where your judgment is impaired, whether that's alcohol or other substances, or even just group activities where there is much more peer pressure. And as much as we like to think that we're not influenced by peer pressure as we get older, it still definitely does affect us to varying degrees. So for as long as I've been driving, I've had this rule that I am not gonna drive with any feeling of alcohol intoxication. I know that the actual legal limit is a BAC of 0.08, but even if I was at a 0.07, no, I'm not driving, because just day to day, the number of times I have close calls and need to be driving very defensively to avoid an accident, just because people on average tend to be very bad at driving, I don't want my ability to drive and to avoid those accidents to be impaired at all. So that's why I really want to be sober, well below the 0.08 limit, before I drive. Another really fitting one, this is actually good because sleep deprivation and alcohol intoxication behind the wheel is often compared. In residency, this was a post-call night, or post-call afternoon rather. I had been up for like 33 or 34 hours. It was a really busy night. I was driving back home, or rather on the way back home, I wanted to pick up Thai food because I was starving. I didn't get a chance to eat anything because I'm a black cloud, and it was just a crazy night. And just to put into perspective how tired I was, imagine staying up for 33 or 34 hours. You're already pretty tired, but then compound that with working for those 33 or 34 hours, and not just working at a computer, but like running around on your feet, being in the operating room, doing some stuff here, running to the emergency room, taking care of some like laceration. I was exhausted, okay? And as I was reversing in the parking lot after picking up this Thai food, I almost hit the car behind me. It was a stationary car. It wasn't a car like moving in the parking lot. It was a parked car that I almost hit. And that's when it occurred to me that being so sleep deprived, I was in no state to get behind the wheel and drive. So the new rule that I obviously created for myself was that if it's post-call and I had a crazy night and I couldn't sleep, then I'm not gonna drive. I'm just gonna call an Uber instead. Now, this whole personal rule business also helped me a lot with inflammatory bowel disease, especially in the first few years when I wasn't nearly as well managed. Now I can kind of eat whatever I want. But back then I had to be really restrictive. Otherwise my symptoms were gonna act up, my gut was gonna be inflamed and angry. So I had some rules, right? So no dairy, no deep fried foods, no red meat, and no dessert. And the first couple weeks of doing that, sure, it's challenging, right? You see your friends, they're eating these other foods and you're tempted. But then after sticking with it for a few weeks, a few months, I didn't have any temptation. I know this is very challenging for some people to believe. They think that you're gonna just yo-yo, and if you're too restrictive with your diet, then you're gonna crave these foods, then binge and go through pints of ice cream. That wasn't my experience, and I ate extremely clean for like 7+ years, probably longer than that. And it was almost like by eating these healthier, fresher, better quality foods rather than the cheap thrill of pizza and burgers, that I learned to appreciate the subtleties of eating fresher, higher quality foods. Like there's actually a lot of nice flavor, like the crunchiness of the lettuce and just the way that your body feels afterwards. So another way that the personal rules really helped me manage my condition. All right, so how can you implement personal rules in your own life, or should you? Now, the point of these rules is not to make your life feel restricted, to feel like you can't do things. I find it's actually liberating in a paradoxical way, because by knowing what is off limits, things that I'm not going to do, I don't need to spend any like mental resources or energy thinking about whether or not I should do that thing. I know, like, nope, I'm just not gonna ever drink and drive. I'm just not gonna ever do X, Y, or Z. And I can then use that energy worrying about other things in that moment, other than wasting time and energy on these sillier decisions. And your personal rules are going to change over time. That's totally normal, totally natural. So back in med school and residency, I had this thing where I wouldn't allow myself to watch TV unless I was stretching or eating a meal, and I would eat very, very fast. And yeah, a lot of people would hear that and be like, oh my God, that sounds like a miserable way to live. Not really, I was happy at the time. I was just grinding really hard in med school and residency. And guess what? I don't do that anymore. In fact, I will watch a whole Formula One race, all 2.5 hours of, or however long it takes. And the reason is because that rule or that guideline is no longer applicable and appropriate for my life now. I have much more time and much more flexibility. I don't have to be in the hospital at a certain time until a certain time, right? But the key thing here is if you are gonna change your rules and your guidelines, do it in a moment of clarity, when you're reflecting, when you're not actually in the moment, but you can think about it, right? In a calm, not emotionally charged, not time crunched situation. Because if you change your rules about drinking and driving after you've been drinking, then you're probably gonna have a bad time. So the way I do this now is I have a document in Notion called Life Lessons and Rules. And I mean, it used to be in Apple Notes, then it used to be in Evernote, and now it's in Notion. It doesn't really matter where you put it. Even a plain text file like saved in Dropbox or on your computer would be fine. The key is that you wanna make it accessible, you wanna make it easy to review, easy to update. Obviously, not everything needs to be written down. This is probably one of the most Kevin Jubal videos that I have ever made. It may be totally opposed to how you wanna live your life, and that's fine. The underlying message and theme here is that there are times when you wanna just trust your past self. And I hope that is useful to you. Thanks for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this video, then you should check out my life lessons of 2020 or 9 things I would tell my 20-year-old self. Much love, and I'll see you guys there.